Good morning and welcome to our seminar Geopolitical Tuesday. I would like to thank especially Professor Anne-Laure Amilhat Szary for Grenoble Alpes University for accepting our invitation. I'm very happy to welcome you to her lecture entitled The Geopolitics of Borders, Cutting Out the Earth and Posing a Vision of the World. For our audience, please turn off your microphones and cameras. And for your information, this conference is recorded and will be available on the YouTube channel of our center. My name is Kinga Torbicka, and I am the research fellow at the Center for French Culture and Francophone Studies at the University of Warsaw. At the beginning, I will present our guest. Then the lecture will start, and afterwards we invite you to question and answer session. You could write your comments or questions on the chat. So now let me present our guest. Anne-Laure Amilhat Szary is a full professor at Grenoble Alpes University and member of the Institut Universitaire de France and former head of the CNRS Pact Research Unit, a pluridisciplinary social sciences research center. She's a political geographer dedicated to border studies, and her comparative analysis of the border dynamics in Latin America and in Europe led her to formulate the notion of mobile border. Her recent research concerned the interrelations between space and art in and about contested places. She is a founding member of the Anti-Atlas Borders Collective, a science art project, and has animated the Performance Lab dedicated to structuring practice-based research in France. So now I invite Professor Anne-Laure Amilhat Szary to present her lecture, The Geopolitics of Borders, Cutting Out the Earth, Imposing a Vision of the World. So, Professor, the screen is yours.
Thank you very much, Kinga. So I would like to start by thanking you, Kinga Torbicka, and the Center for French Civilizations and Francophone Studies at the University of Warsaw. I'm very happy to share this afternoon with you all. And I hope you can all see my screen by now, and that we can go through a pretty robust presentation for this afternoon. So I have given the presentation this title because it is very much inspired by a book that I have published in French in 2020, with an edition publishers called Le Cavalier Bleu, which was called Géopolitique des frontières, découper la terre, imposer une vision du monde, meaning that when we draw borders, and when we make up international limits, not only do we share the words into different states, but we do much more. We impose a certain representation of the world, and this is I will take the time with you this afternoon to decipher this way of working out geopolitics through border making. So, as you all know, and let me just do this. As you all know, borders, I don't know how much you know of borders, but borders have become very topical in the past 2 years, especially since the planet was hit by a small element called COVID-19. And as you can see from this caricature from a website, lots of people were protecting many things and were ready to confront big armies, missiles of all kinds, terrorism, or they thought that they were not ready for what happened and what came to put the world to a halt. And the only measure, one of the measures at the time that was taken, was to reinforce borders and to close the world and to try to use this tool of the border to solve health problems, which many of the border experts at the time thought was not the proper answer to this global crisis, but this is how it went. So my purpose today is to give you a view into what is behind the scene, or to help you get tools to understand such complex landscape as the ones that appear on the screen right now. That is, go beyond the spectacle of the border and work on this very intricate link between the visibility and the invisibility of the border that Alison Mounds really stressed upon in a very key paper that she published in 2015 called Invisibility and the Securitization of Migration. And she called and where she was am I still sharing the screen right now? Is it okay for you?
Is it okay?
Okay, perfect. So I just changed screen so that I could look at you and the screen at the same time. So in this paper, she was she stressed the fact that politicians, state makers, warmongers all try to shed light on a certain type of border making, and that was more and more confrontational, and which most visible side was the making of walls. And here you have pictures taken in Jerusalem. But she stressed upon the fact that this did not make the whole border game. A lot remained unseen, and while our attention was drawn to focusing on those very visible elements, we were in certain ways made to forget about the rest and what was happening in the shade of the wall. In the shade of the wall being the title of a very good book on this Israeli-Palestinian security barrier. So in this case, what is very interesting about the wall is that you can see that when you see it from slightly above and from diagonal perspective, not confronting it face to face, you can see that this wall, which appears as normally in the picture it appears as a very linear, is in fact totally sinuous. It makes curves, and it makes curves in the landscape in such a way that makes it very difficult for somebody who doesn't know the terrain that well to say which side is which side is East Jerusalem, eastern side of Jerusalem, and the Palestinian side, and which is the western and Israeli side of it. Because the landscape prior to the building of the wall was actually pretty homogeneous. So what I'm saying here is that the border making is splitting up a space that used to be not totally homogeneous, but used to be made of relationships, of links, and that it is breaking them up in many ways. So what I will try to do in the time that I have, and I will rush through some parts of it, but you can then have the PowerPoint, is to show you some basic elements, geographic elements, to make so that you can make by yourselves you can make up your own geographical grammar of borders and understand them better than simply by putting them and drawing them on the map as lines. And once we are done with space, we will go to time and examine the very complex temporalities of borders, and we will conclude and open up on the notion of violence, which is very much expressed in all kinds of ways at borders, and enhances the violence of the process of border making. So let's start with the spatial alphabet. What I didn't say before I began the talk is that you can, of course, ask questions in the chat. It's not that easy for me to be following the chat and speaking at the same time. So if you do want to ask questions, don't hesitate to just open your mic and ask a question. I can all keep them to the end. As it's your choice. It's your choice. So, spatial alphabet. What do I mean by this? What I mean, I'm sorry, I just forgot to translate the three big words on the, especially the first one, which is not the same in French and English. What I mean is that geographers have tools that help reinterpret what we call usually international relations. International relations being relations between states, nation states, and relations of power between those states, as if those states were coherent ensembles that interact one with another. And actually, when we look at international relations from the border, seeing as a border, if you wish, we understand that the state of the world does not really correspond to the map, and that we need other tools to do this. So borders appear both as a revealing and catalyzing this new order of the world, and make up for a good geographic laboratory to understand those changes. I will decompose the border between lines, points, and zones, and so you will understand how those work. So my question is the following: is the starting point a line or a point? I'm using here a definition that is in its original version in French, and I will translate, which is an interesting definition of the border, because it comes from the International Court of Justice at The Hague, and it was released within the arbitrary judgment on the dispute on the maritime border between Senegal and Guinea-Bissau in 1989. So this sentence has profound legal meaning, and it is quite interesting for geographers and social scientists. So what it says is that an international border is a line, the line formed by the succession of extreme points of the domain of spatial validity for a state's judicial legal norms. So it's a piling up of statements in a way. What it says is that a state has the power to issue norms, legal norms, norms of law, and those norms of law will expand within a domain of where they are valid, and this domain which makes them valid has limits, and these limits are the borders. It's a little bit different from the usual definitions based on sovereignty, and I like that one because it says that this extreme line limit, external limit of this domain of validity of this, the law which is issued by a state, is made by a succession of extreme points. So what is interesting here is that the court acknowledges the fact that the border as a line is a sort of view of the mind, because on the land you can never trace actually a line. You only can demarcate and locate milestones, you can take GPS points, and you relate them like when you're a kid and you have to draw a figure out of little dots which have numbers, if you will. So this is an interesting decomposition of the notion of a line that I will now build up upon. So we usually think of borders as lines, and thinking of borders as lines allows us to build maps and to color patches on the map which underline the existence of coherent sub-ensembles, subsets, which are the states. As you see, this map is a map of the world seen from Japan. So many things appear here. The fact of course, the states are here, the colored patches, but those colored patches appear in a way as peripheral because Japan is an island, and the main focus, if you look at the world from there, is the ocean. So spaces which on the map, on this kind of map, appear as borderless, although we know that exclusive zones exist and border delimit maritime spaces. What appears also here, as you see, is that the little Europe that we belong to is totally on the edge, almost out of the world. You know, in the old maps and in the old times when people thought the world was flat, when you got towards the edge, you could almost fall. So here, when you live actually in the UK, you're probably almost on the edge and you can fall on the other side. We never know what the other side is, but it used to look something a little bit more like hell than paradise. So decentering is not enough to understand border making and its challenges. There have been also attempts to design the world upside down and to stress the fact that when we map the world, of course, we always tend to map ourselves as the most powerful, and these kind of representations debunk our traditional visions. They debunk those traditional visions, but they still rely on the little colored patches, and they don't really question them. What we want to do here is to go beyond this game on maps and to emancipate ourselves from what I call a tautology. So a tautology is a demonstration which proves something that was already known in the beginning. In a way, if you go and use a dictionary, any very traditional dictionary, those very simple ones, not the scientific encyclopedic ones. If you look at the definition for a state, you'll see that it is the authority which has sovereignty over territory that is demarked by borders. If you look at the definition of a border, it's the limit, external limit of the territory over which a state extends its sovereignty, etc., etc. Those four words are always used one on another to define the others. So in a way, if we're not careful, we can really get trapped into this self-referencing. in a way, this is what the geographer John Agnew denounced already many years ago, more than 25, when he evoked the notion of a trap, the territorial trap. This territorial trap is one which forces us to see the world according to those external lines and this very fixed world. Sorry for the little spelling mistake here. And what globally John Agnew's work has offered us in the years that have followed this seminal paper is to look at the world not as it should exist by law. This is the de jure situation, but to look at the world as it does exist de facto, that is beyond what the law says. And as you know, even if we are supposed to do some things very many times since we are kids, we do otherwise. We're not allowed to go out after midnight. We come back at 1, 2, 3 a.m. and we hope our parents don't catch us. Well, the same for geopolitics. And this actually leads to declining all of those notions. And I see many spelling mistakes on my on this slide. I'm sorry. To look at this notion of variation of regimes, which I will detail a little bit more, but I don't really have time to go into that much explanations. So what I'm interested in is the fact that the border and the analysis of the border is a very good way of going and of getting the good tools to understand the de facto functioning of geopolitics. Because indeed, a border is not any kind of limit, and it's not only the institution that is supposed to define and defend it. In a way, the border is really not only that line that you saw on the map. The border is an interaction, a constant interaction between an institution, a representation, and a practice of space. What I mean is, imagine I'm telling you, go and see the borders of Poland and come back. Well, if you don't have a map of Poland, you will never get there, because some of them are demarcated, some of them are not. Some of them are heavily defended, some of them are much less. Sometimes you will meet people, if you look for that border and you don't understand how the map really works, or the GPS, you're out of battery and you can't rely upon your GPS. Well, you will meet people there and ask them where the border is, and they will tell you what's the end of the road. It is, if it's a border guard that you're asking to, he or she will know a little better. But what I'm saying here is that we don't really know which is the hen and which is the egg, but the border exists because someday somebody says, let's suppose that behind this line, people are different, that beyond this line, and that the line can sustain a discontinuity that has political meaning. So this was a representation, but it worked because the people who said, let's do this, let's invent this, let's give this really high, heavy political weight to the border, were not anybody. They were actually ambassadors, representatives of kings and queens, and they had the power to change the fate of the world. So they represented an institution. But when those people, powerful people, started to implement their representations and to invent the modern borders that we know and that function more or less as lines, they could not do it if they didn't have a set of tools to help them make their way through the process. And that is, for example, the invention of modern borders happened at the time when modern maps were invented. And indeed, if you don't have a map, you cannot really get to the border. And it happened also because even if they were inventing this in a cabinet far from the border, they had soldiers, they had custom people, they had many people on the field who could then make the border work and do all, and indeed all the social sciences now speak of something called as border work. And in the peripheral regions, it's very interesting to see how this border work actually organized itself in many families, in some regions which were peripheral, which were poor, far from big cities, far from the capital cities. Well, in the same family, you could have a customs officer on one side, and the other brother would be a smuggler. And somehow they would decide between themselves what to do on which day. And it still happens to the date. So without those people on the land who fight, who defend, who enhance normative regimes, the border does not exist. So all in all, what I'm saying here is that there is a very performative dimension to this notion of border, and this is an excerpt from the book. Of border is both a practice and an institution in a very performative interaction. Go and see a border, wanting to touch it on the field, to see it, to touch it. All this needs a map or a GPS that tells us where it goes through, how it crosses the land. Because the line itself does not necessarily appear within the landscape as a linear discontinuity. Without a map, it is not possible to go to the place of the border, nor to invent a linear border. There is one exception, however, to this triangulation of the map, the border and the territory, which is what we have called meta discontinuities. Meta discontinuities are borders that are or used to be traced even before knowing what the territory was made of. And one can think, for example, as of the Tordesillas meridian, the split that was proclaimed to be by the Pope after Columbus came back from the Americas, and the kings and queens of Portugal and Spain were starting to fight over the empire that had just been discovered, but nobody knew how big it was. The Pope said, well, I will draw a line, and on one side it will be Spanish, and on the other side it will be Portuguese. And nobody knew how much land that meant for both parties. So but the notion of meta, of division, of linear division already existed. I will skip this because I don't have time. So what we witness today is that we still have lines, a lot of them. I mean, the map hasn't changed that much, or it is changing by adding more and more lines. We really have to remember one thing from this representation that we see as ongoing, everlasting, something that has always existed. The fact that when the United Nations were created, we only had in the world about 50 states, and today 70 years later, we have almost 200. So there is nothing less stable than a border, even if it's a line and even if it's on the map. What we see today is that more and more of those borders between countries are being closed, are being places where barriers, walls are built. And I will not address directly this notion of walls, but I would just want to draw your attention to the fact that if a border is generally can be considered as a dyad, the term is on my PowerPoint on my screen. A dyad is a line shared between two states, and is a point of equilibrium, of balance in a sort between those two states. When a wall exists, in general, this wall is not built by both sides. So the fact that more and more walls are being built means that borders are less and less symmetrical, and less places of power balance, but more and more places of exaltation of the power of one country over the next side. What I want to stress through is the fact that borders are points that make up lines, but more and more borders are much more complex from a spatial point of view. They are becoming thicker and thicker lines, to a point where one may even think they are no longer lines, but something else, maybe a zone, maybe something that is very that can be expressed with viscosity. What do I mean by a thicker and thicker border? I mean that the functions of the border, that of controlling passage, that of knowing from the good, acceptable and non-acceptable mobilities and flows that grow through it. Well, those functions, those controls are more and more positioned not on the line directly. It is the case for goods, it is the case for human people, it is the case also for information. Let's just look at goods and people here. As for people on the right-hand side of the border, you can see that more and more European countries, especially since the conference of La Valette in 2015, well, the European countries and the European Union as a conjunct of countries have externalized a part of their sovereign power to control their borders to countries where people who want to go to Europe either live or go through. And they are doing so by sending people, by sending technology to those countries, especially through all of Africa. And if you can see on this map, which is a political poster that denounces this politics of exportation and externalization, this goes very far south. So in this case, what it does is that it implies that non-EU member states, states that have not signed the main texts concerning the respect of human rights, such as the Geneva Convention on refugees, as Libya, for example. Well, those receive a lot of power, money, funds to undertake these border checks. And so the border, instead of being this line around the country, becomes something very longitudinal. It's a long process, and something that is very long to, very difficult, becomes harder and harder to cross for the people who try to. Concerning goods, you can see on the left-hand side of the screen the map of the Container Security Initiative, by which a great number of harbors all throughout the world have signed with the Department of Homeland Security and Customs in the US, the agreements that allow assermented officials, US officials, to operate in all of those harbors, check the containers before they go on board the ships that will bring them to the US ports, meaning that when they arrive and when they reach the US, they are considered more secure and they can spend less time, so that the owners of the ship spend less money, and that the country is less feels less burdened by the security, by the requested security checks. These controlled dissemination of those control points is such that it really reaches out to very, very many points within space. So many points, and so many points that in many ways are related, linked one with each other, in such a way that we can talk of reticular borders that work in which procedures are operated through network, data network, people network, information networks. In this case, you have a map. You can see a map of detention facilities used to control and retain people whose migratory status is illegal all through Europe. And you can see that those are located not only at the borders, but within the main cities, and also very much outside of Europe on all the shores of the Mediterranean, deep within Libya or Algeria, for example. One artist has tried now to capture the Google Earth location, all of those camps, and she has copy-pasted all of those 407 camps that she registered in 2015, and she put them, she pasted them together, trying to give a notion, to give back a notion of speciality to a phenomenon that is very much reticular, and because when it is reticular, when it works in a network form, it is hard to understand its impact and its spread. And when you see actually this big wall being covered by all the space dedicated to detention facilities in Europe, well, you get probably a better and more intimate feeling of the importance and intensity of the process. When we speak of zonality of the border and extension of the border, we speak of dissemination of border checks, we speak of security, but we can also speak and see that in a more positive way because on both sides of borderlines, there are different kind of cooperation that take place and form and get to form what geographers call cross-border regions based on different kinds of cooperations, political, economical, social, cultural, regional. I don't really have time to go into detail, but it makes up for dynamics of border interaction that show us the different possibilities of borderlands that can be very much separated, but in most cases are coexistent, interdependent, or integrated, according to one of the first typologies that was built up by the geographer Oscar Martinez in the 90s. This is another set of drawings that I don't really have time to detail. What I will want to stress, and maybe go towards conclusion, I will not go through all the demonstration that I wanted to do with you because of time, is the fact that once we have set up this spatial alphabet of lines, of points, of zones, of networks, we are then endowed with better tools to understand the de facto situation that is behind the map. And in many ways, today, many things happen behind the map, or in an invisible, in a way that is invisibilized by the map. And one of them is the system of land grabbing. I don't know if you heard of that, but today, if a state or if a corporation within a state, or if a group of inhabitants between a state want to get hold of better resources, more resources, they do not have to process as states did in the 19th century, that is, go and colonize the world, wage wars, and conquest territory and process to a sovereign establishment over this new conquered land. What they need to do is to rent the land, and these rents can, in some cases, be very long-term rents, rents over decades, rents over a century. These are called these are very long-term rents, and those rents are becoming more and more common. Why? Because powerful countries that feel they don't have enough resources to feed their population, that feel they don't have enough resources for energy reasons, for example, but they want more biofuels, in a way. What they need to do is to make an agreement with a government or with a regional government to rent land. And when they do so, they don't buy the land, they just get the possibility to use it and use its resources. Meaning, if a Chinese company invests in Ethiopia outside of Addis Ababa to run greenhouses and to grow vegetables to bring back to China, they will use a lot of water that escaped the population of the capital city of Ethiopia, but they don't steal the land. However, for the population locally, it becomes more complex to grow their own vegetables because of lack of water. So you see, there is a competition. It does create the conditions for competition over resources, even without a transfer of sovereignty. In other cases, the foreign investor will rent the land to grow soja, for example, or for cattle, cows or so. And Argentina realized very recently that almost 15% of its territory had been rented to foreign investors, 15, because they didn't have all the data, they had not accumulated the data. And the problem with those, with this kind of rent in Argentina, for example, is that the renters don't respect the environmental norms for pesticides. They don't respect the rhythm of the recuperation of the land, of the earth. And so after some time, and that time can be very short, maybe sometimes less, even 10 years, the land is almost dead. The land is out of use, again, it still belongs to the country of origin, but it has escaped the benefit of the national population. And in this case, what is very, very important to note is that those land grabbing processes do not happen illegally. They are all based on contracts, but those contracts are most often based on private law, or they're signed between the state and a private company. And so the constituency of the concerned country or region is not allowed to have access to this contract and to even examine the terms of that contract. And so there is this process of land grabbing, and this is why it is so criticized. Explains how finally, even if borders do not move, the land and the resources can escape and can escape the control of the country which is supposed to be responsible for them. So as you see, this story of borders is a long lasting one, is a complex one, and actually what is interesting, fascinating, and complicated about borders is that if you isolate one single function of it, you miss it. You miss the big picture, and you miss the fact that what is actually interesting and important about the border is that it has been made a flexible institution, which is very useful for the profit of capital, which is very useful for running the world as it is and not which is also a very violent way of running it. I will come to the end of this of the conference and allow space for our discussion. So as you see, this border, which is not a line, but a set of points, but a zone, but very thick, but longitudinal, is probably a border that is not very easy to cross. So there is one counterpoint that is very easy to take, which is the one that is claimed by a lot of the Chicano people in the land between the US and Mexico. And they say, we didn't cross the border crossed us, we didn't move. And that could be said in many regions of Poland, which has known so many borders. The border, we didn't move, the border moved, and we have to adapt to it. Basically, it is very interesting to to see that today, in front of this very complex spatial alphabet of the borders, more and more thinkers, building on feminist literature, building on post-colonial literature, tend to reframe the ways we think of borders, not only from the point of view of the state, but from the point of view of the micro, and saying, well, we people are the borders. The first to say that was a Chicana lesbian poet called Gloria Anzaldúa, who wrote both in Spanish and in English, and she said, I'm the border. And in a very famous paper on border thinking, two feminist writers wrote the following sentence, which I really invite you to ponder upon, which is the fact that our feminist consciousness is grounded in being the border which cuts across oneself, not merely crossing borders and observing them from a detached vantage point, saying the border is not only there, the border is important because we can feel it in our bodies. And I think this is also another scale yet that it needs and to be questioned. A lot of that literature stresses this, from Gloria Anzaldúa to post-colonial thinker Achille Mbembe, whom I invite you to read. And maybe I will finish with this quote. Sorry, winter has come here. It's from Gloria Anzaldúa, from a very famous poem that she wrote. And I will use the rest of the material that I wanted to present to you in the questions. And in this very famous poem, Gloria Anzaldúa, which is called "To Live in the Borderlands Means You," that is the name of the title of the poem. She says, in the borderlands, you are the battleground. You are at home a stranger. You are wounded, lost in action. To survive in the borderlands, you must live sin fronteras, be a crossroads. And I think that more than the sin fronteras, the fact that we are crossroads, and that it is interesting to think of borders as one of the vantage points to think of the world as being crisscrossed by crossroads, can be interesting. And maybe I will stop here because of time reasons. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Professor Anne-Laure Amilhat Szary, for your very interesting lecture about the borders from very different perspective. So now we invite you to ask your questions. You could write your comments on the chat or raise your hand if you want to use your micro. We have the first question on the chat from Mateusz Dwiliński. What is the most viable alternative to the institution of borders in order to keep the same level of security and to overcome centuries of cultural and other divides between certain groups of people?
Okay, so this is I think this is a very, very interesting question, and the very interesting point of your question is the notion of viability, of sustainability. My question to your question is, what do we mean by the same level of security? Because we tend to think of our beginning of the 21st century world as insecure, and as borders as being places of insecurity. But if we look at security panoramas before that have existed in the past, we are not that bad. So the question is, there are two questions in your questions. divides between certain groups of people. Well, the nation states have tried to, the building of the nation state has put forward certain scales of group making between people, and it tries to erase all kinds of differences between those groups. But we have seen in the past that those nation states are not so stable. So what do we do of that when the Czech Republic, when the Czechoslovakia Republic becomes two countries, for example? What is the certain group of people, and where should the good divide be? And what I can, so I'm just pushing you forward to think of the border as a place of enactment of regimes of law more than a place of enactment of division between people, because there are, for example, people speaking Dutch in Belgium and people speaking Dutch in Holland. Should they be in the same country because they are the same cultural people? I think borders are limits of normative perimeters. And what is actually proved is that the more the level of cooperation between the border, the better the level of security. So what is the most viable alternative to the institution of borders? I don't know if there is an alternative to the institution of borders, but what I think is that cooperation over borders rather than closure of borders is a guarantee for security. And that has been considered through research in different continents, especially under the supervision of Emmanuel Brunet-Jailly, who has undertaken comparative research between Europe and the Americas. And this is what comes out the most. The problem with the closure of borders and with asymmetrical diets, as I showed you, is that you get to lose contact with the other side. You don't know them, and you don't share data, you don't share intelligence, and this is what is needed to make the border function. I don't know if I answered well your question.
Thank you very much. So if there is any other questions, please, you are welcome for your comments also. Don't be shy. It's a real pleasure to hear about this concept of borders also from the French perspective. So I hope there will be some questions. So maybe I will ask you about the concept of war, because in the context of recent war in Ukraine, we talk a lot about the relations between borders and wars. And I have one question. If the borders produce wars or the wars produce borders, because we heard about a lot of different responses about this. And what do you think about?
Well, I think that borders are the outcome of war, and generally they stabilize a front line in order to make peace. But also, of course, if this stabilization is not balanced enough between the two counterparts or the three counterparts, there is a big risk of what we call irredentism. That is the fact that people want to go back on the other side, or that people are not actually clear with the territorial delimitation, and they want to wage another war in order to change the border, people being a very vast notion. But so yes, there are wars that are waged because of borders. In the case of Ukraine, I think yes, it's about a border, but it's more about a sea. It's about about the fact that during the USSR period, the Soviet Union had access to the sea, and all of a sudden, the fact that this belonged to Ukraine didn't really matter because it was under the same sovereignty. All of a sudden, there is a border and a separation, and that becomes really meaningful. And there is an instrumentalization of the populations there, saying they want to be on that side and on the other side. Whereas I think it's more than it's really more a question of access to resources and access to strategic locations. What I feel too is the fact that there would have been a way, probably, and I'm not the only one to think of that, and I've spoken of that with people who are diplomats. There would have been a way of, for example, saying, well, Ukraine has the land, but Russia has access to the sea, and there are possibilities of building postmodern shared sovereignty that are that do work, but that are hard to defend from a populist point of view, and that are probably less bankable from a political point of view, because it means it's a win-win situation, but it's not the strong ends. So yeah, this is it. And yes, and my other point, I think if you look at the link between war and borders today, you see that less and less wars are waged about borders. Ukraine is the big counter example. But I actually have that slide. I had it. I didn't show it to you. It's here. Wars used to be waged about for territorial reasons. More and more conflicts and casualties happen within borders. Think of Colombia. Think of Syria. Think of Iran today. Afghanistan. So Kivu, for example, is more of a cross-border issue, because there are armed groups from Rwanda acting in Congo, and it's a big regional mess in a way. But so yes, to sum up, yes, borders are testimonies of past wars, that is for sure. There are also testimonies of the fact that we were able to make peace. They don't salvage peace. I mean, they were invented after a big war. They were invented. Linear borders were invented to stop war, that did not prevent war. They even allowed more wars, but it's not always the case. Emmanuel Brunet-Jailly, to cite him once more, has a big study on different kinds of border disputes, and he shows that, of course, states, actors fight a lot about borders, but when those disputes are functional, meaning that they are over resources, the odds are greater that agreements can be can be met, because there is something to share. If you only fight across because of a few acres of land, the weight of this land is very symbolic, and it's very hard to find a peace that can be that can please both sides, politically speaking.
Thank you very much. We have another question from Amelia Głowacka. How will the meaning of borders evolve in the aspect of environmental changes affecting the whole world?
Well, I think this is the main question for today, for tomorrow, and this is actually something that we are trying to write about, is how indeed do we how do we consider that we have to how do we consider that the environmental challenges that we meet go beyond the defense of our borders, and that addressing those environmental issues within the borders is not enough to meet up the challenge. So I think it would be the rational evolution of borders would be towards more cooperation. I think what will happen first is exactly the opposite, because politics are not rational, as we saw with COVID, and because in front of unknown or difficult events that are difficult to plan and to forecast, the easy political solution is to show strength and force. So it will go towards security to a point of rupture and probably to war. Whereas we should of course think the opposite.
Thank you very much.
There is another one. As globalism becomes more popular, will border security become more relaxed around the world, or are the relaxed borders in Europe simply a result of European cooperation? Well, relaxed borders in Europe are the result of European cooperation. Relaxed internal borders in Europe are only one side of the European borders, because the external borders of Europe are not relaxed at all. And we have also a number of countries within Europe that, especially in the Visegrad group, that reject this notion of relaxed borders, even within the Union. So will border security become more relaxed? I would hope so. I'm not sure. I hope that the sharing of intelligence worldwide may enhance security, not necessarily at the border, allowing more equality and more justice in terms of border crossings.
Okay. Thank you very much. If there is any questions, like you said, the function of borders also evaluated during different crises, and this is very interesting, because we saw that during the pandemic crisis, and also we observed this during this Ukrainian war. And I think this importance of the borders show us how important it is in the world today. So if you don't have any questions, I think we will stop here. And thank you very much, Professor Anne-Laure Amilhat Szary, for accepting our invitation and for explaining us this very, very interesting and very actual topic. And we invite you to our next session on the 6th of December. Professor Stepanka Zemanova from Charles University will present non-state sanctions against Russia, senders, targeting effectiveness and ethics. So thank you very much for today, and goodbye.
Thank you to all for your attention.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Goodbye. Thank you.